Kelsey, welcome to my podcast. I'm super glad we're doing this. And maybe start by introducing yourself.
Thanks, Ida. Pleasure to be here. So I am a researcher, economics researcher of well-being at STATEC Research in Luxembourg. And STATEC Research is the research division of the official Statistical and Economic Studies Institute of Luxembourg. So, typically official statistical offices don't have research divisions, but it's actually part of the law here in Luxembourg, and we have a group of about 10 to 12 of us we're in the process of hiring. And it's a little different than in the US, where we have so many different organizations. We have the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Census Bureau. Luxembourg's much smaller, so we just have a one organization that does this. And of course, that's what I'm doing now, but it took me a few years to get here. I've been here for 6 years now, in Luxembourg. You can probably tell from my accent, and I'm imagining most of your audience will be Americans, and so I fit into that bucket. But then have since moved to Europe.
And so the Statistical Research Institute, is it in charge of all the statistics of Luxembourg? Like a combined BA and BLS and financial statistics, all of it?
Yep, all of the statistics are done here at STATEC. And a big part of what they're thinking about, all of the statistical offices in Europe, are really complying with Eurostat guidelines. So Eurostat is the organization set up at the European Union level. And they say, we want you to collect this, and this information. We do some ad hoc or individual data collection, production, and analysis that's going to be separate. But the starting point is going to be what Eurostat requires of us. And we're producing everything, GDP, unemployment. Those are the, kind of the ones you think about generally, but also the census is going through us.
Can you give an example of some of the Eurostat guidelines? Does it basically say things like you need to measure GDP, or is it that kind of stuff?
Yeah, actually, and I'll just give you an example that's a lot of fun. So one is inflation. So, we have a consumer price index, and that's going to be, they actually develop on this. You think that if you're not in this area of the world, that it, might be somewhat static, that the research hasn't changed over the past, 50 years. But in fact, they are, trying to innovate by using big data. So they will take the information coming from scanners at, specifically grocery stores, but other places as well, to use current prices and also the quantities that people are buying of the various different objects, goods and services. And then you can come up with a consumer price basket, right? Then whenever it reaches a rate change at 2.5%, there's actually a standard indexation that occurs within Luxembourg where people get an increase in their wages. So it's not for every position, but for government positions and many others. So people in Luxembourg are actually quite fond of us because their raises, their adjustments are typically coming from us. To answer more specifically your question related to GDP, it's not, I think that, of course, we would be collecting that kind of information even if Eurostat wasn't telling us. But there are certain guidelines under which, that we follow to produce this kind of information. And again, these guidelines are also changing. So there is, a group that, especially with the OECD, but also the United Nations, that talks about systems of national accounts, how they should be measured, and including adjustments for things. Not right now, let's say environmental accounting is something that they are thinking about how to incorporate, when to incorporate. Also, to make the data comparable with in the past as well as today. So it's something that is not done rapidly. Also, we benefit as a small country from the expertise of the world in this regard.
And so you said that having a research group at the institute is mandated by law. Does that make Luxembourg unique in Europe?
It's I would say fairly unique, so not truly unique, in that we are among the few that have research groups. I don't know if it's mandated by law anywhere else. The idea is that we produce data, and if you also use data, then it can better inform what kind of data should be produced. And again, it's a small organization, so we have this, or a small country, small organization, an opportunity to provide this feedback back and forth a little bit better than you would in another place where you essentially have to get feedback externally from users of your data. So there are smaller groups. I think that the Netherlands and also Belgium have some people that I've interacted with that would be, let's say, closely associated with, although not necessarily strictly within their data collection units.
And so are most of you economists at the Institute?
Actually, generally, no, I would say. So at my organization, in the research group, all economists, but at the Institute as a whole, mostly statisticians. And they have conferences for this group of people. So typically they meet every 2 years, and it's the International Association for Official Statistics. And so they are meeting to discuss things like composite indicators, how they should be put together, when they should be used, also trust in statistics. So one thing that's a bit different for us compared to the industry at large is if we lose the trust of our constituents, it may be difficult for us to regain that trust and to get it back. So if a private organization loses trust, they potentially lose profit, especially related to this one product. And then think of Facebook and challenges it's had around privacy. If we, however, lost trust, then we would have a reduction, let's say, in the number of people who provide us data. Some of it's mandated by law, but some of it is going to be survey data that isn't always strictly mandated by law. And then we have a problem. So that's something that is discussed. How do you develop new statistics, new techniques for calculating or collecting data, and at the same time provide the quality assurance that's necessary for people to trust what's being done?
Would you say there is I imagine there's some data you can collect without having to rely on a survey, and some data is survey based. And the survey data always has the bottleneck that people may not want to answer the survey, or there may be a selection bias in who wants to answer the survey. Is there a move away from using survey data wherever possible, or is that not really something that's considered?
Well, I gave you the example earlier about using scanner data in the grocery stores. So I think that the idea for now is to supplement survey data. And also, as you know, and I imagine we'll get to, my main area of expertise is actually using survey data. And there's a lot of criticism of it, especially within economics. People don't trust what respondents are saying. But some of our most important data do come from surveys, though. So the labor force survey is conducted. I think it's just ongoing, but we're typically reporting on a monthly basis, employment statistics, and that's coming from a survey. And I don't know if there would be a way to collect that kind of information alternatively. As you know, or one example is that you have people who file for unemployment benefits. And so you could use that as a, let's say, revealed action, behavioral response to a situation. But not everybody applies for benefits or applies for benefits on time. So in that case, we're trusting the survey data first. However, I do think that there is going to be an ever greater push to move towards alternative sources, such as big data, like the scanner.
So maybe this is a good moment to give a little bit of a background of what is it that you research, and also what led you there, how your interests developed.
Yeah. So we spent some time talking about something that's really far from my expertise, just that I'm housed in this research unit or in this statistical office. So I'll go all the way back, and starting with the PhD and even a little bit before that. So I had previously worked as a consultant for 4 years, and what I did was business valuation. And I got there in a kind of a roundabout way because essentially through some recommendations I've received from some good advice I've received from people over the years, when you don't know what you want to do, make sure not to close any doors. So as long as I'm taking up opportunities that don't restrict me from choosing something else later. So I went to an interview and then ultimately took a job based on this principle. So I never really wanted to work in the corporate setting, especially the setting I was in. However, I felt like it was a good opportunity to learn something new. And in general, that's beneficial. So then I went back to school and I knew that I wanted to study economics. Economics has always been as soon as I learned about it, it's always been my field of choice. I like people, I like studying people, but using a more structured approach. And then, all right, so our field is so broad, what to study. And I didn't want to just study something that was going to get me a job necessarily. I was leaving a career. I wanted to study something that I felt like was the most meaningful. And so I'm studying happiness. I'm studying the economics of happiness. Of course, happiness is a broad term. We use a bit more precise definitions than that. And I have been doing that now. So I learned about this field. I think I was thinking about it probably in 2009. So that's been quite some time now, 14 years. So approximately, I didn't start the research until 2011. So 12 years. And
so you knew about the economics of happiness going into your PhD in economics.
Yeah. So I took some time to try to figure out where to study and who to study with. And my master's degree prior to that was in mineral economics. I valued businesses in the mining industry. But I studied mineral economics because it was the only economics master's that my undergraduate master's degree program offered. So I knew I didn't want to study that. And so I spent some time and I picked up a book on gross national happiness led by Bhutan, and then discovered the happiness, area of research, and then found USC and as well as a few other schools, of course, while applying for the PhD programs. So I knew about it and was really excited about the opportunity to go to USC because of their specialty in the economics of happiness.
Right. And I guess that was quite fortunate too, right? Because as we all know, when you apply for a PhD in economics, it's kind of a broad swoop where you apply to a lot of schools, and there's definitely some randomness in terms of where you get in or not because there's such high competition, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I have to say that I've been lucky over numerous occasions because I was applying at the time, with location constraints. And, so I didn't apply everywhere. And, it really worked out. I'm quite pleased with that outcome. Yeah, I got lucky.
So since you mentioned location constraints, I feel like it's a term that gets thrown around a lot in the academic context, and I haven't really heard it from people working in tech, say. Maybe you could elaborate a little bit on the topic.
Well, as you said, competition is really high. We are in a global industry, global field. So we're competing with people from all around the world to go to certain schools and then ultimately to work in certain positions. And, and then those schools are more dispersed than I think a lot of the jobs are. So in fact, the jobs, I think there are a lot of constraints, but people have kind of accepted them up front. So a lot of times you're going to work in the US and only in a couple of major cities if you're going to work in tech. And for us, in PhD in economics, you can work anywhere in the world, but if you want to work in research, you're going to go to one of, a certain number of schools. If I remember correctly, there was, when we were finishing, around 300 jobs for researchers around the world. There was something like 2,000 jobs available approximately 1,200 candidates, so more jobs than we could than we wanted, but only 300 for researchers. And then you're going to choose based on a basket of options, right? Location being one of them. And for you, I guess also tech is one of those industries where it's more accepting of remote work, right? So
yeah, definitely in the last years it has changed. But even before that, I had remote jobs before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. And it also partially because it's something you prioritize, right? So if you had chosen let's say a more traditional field, you say you're in finance or something like that, you would have needed to have been in the office and wearing a suit of some sort.
Yeah, that's and it's I mean, at least for me, it's a big one. I'm not willing to, I guess, to compromise on some of the things that define quality of life for me, where not having to commute is one of them. And some people don't mind it, and so it's a matching problem. And I think what's really nice about the pandemic is that I think it has expanded on the possibilities of more precise matching in terms of jobs and people.
I think, though, a lot of that, in general, I agree with you. A lot of that's still in tech. There's a push for managers want their people to be back. And what's interesting, in hybrid option, typically, you're also in the US where, everybody, wherever you reside in the US is fine. There are tax considerations in Europe. So there are various tax treaties. So if I were to actually be paid by Americans and reside here in the US, that should be, in Europe, that should be okay. But if I'm paid by a European employer and reside in a different European state, it affects their tax treaties. And so that has important implications as well.
Do you think there's less remote work in Europe than in the US in tech?
I don't interact with a lot of people in tech here. So I'm coming from, a country where it's much more traditional, let's just say. And I think that tech is exploding in the US, but you just don't see the same in Europe, right? I think the United States is a more dynamic labor market. And so my interaction with people here is going to be far more limited, and I don't have the data. So I think I would just give you wrong numbers. So I'm not sure.
I know. And it's something we could probably look up, and maybe it's an interesting topic. One thing that's interesting about the remote work that was mentioned in a venture capital webinar I led recently was that for people who entered their career during COVID and they have only worked remotely, and say they're from undergrad, because if you did a PhD, you're used to working alone in your room and being productive. But for people who finished undergrad maybe remotely and then only have had remote jobs, that they might not even know what hard work means or what actual work means. And so because there's no point of reference for them.
Well, but that's incredibly judgmental. Who knows what actual work, so I don't say that's on your side. It's because there are people, it's interesting, right? During the pandemic, do you feel like you worked more or less? And for you, or let me restate. So you were working remotely before anyway. Some people worked more, some people worked less.
Yeah.
Because they did. Go ahead.
Yeah, and I just want to clarify this statement before about not knowing what actual work means. This was from venture capitalists who invest in companies. But I agree, right? It's ambiguous. For example, for me personally, I'm more productive when I work from home.
Right. Yeah. So sorry, I knew it wasn't you who was making the judgmental statement. It's this point of view of a different generation. And, it's part of the reason why managers want to have their employees in the office is because some of them like to micromanage. Some of them don't trust their employees. Some of them don't know how to measure the output of their employees to know if they're doing a decent job. And so I think that we are going to have just a tremendous number of shifts over the next few years, and then going forward too, as large language models take over. I have a friend who at first he was reluctant to say or to admit that he took his work from 5 days down to 1 using ChatGPT. And then a couple of months later, he had this open discussion with his boss. His boss was encouraging everyone to do the same. And how they're going to maintain employment levels or productivity changes, I'm not sure. It's too early to say. But thankfully, he had a boss which was, open to it and didn't fire him, make an adjustment right there on the spot. But yeah, this is, it's not just working from home, and everything's going to change.
I agree. And I think what you said about the managers is a really key point, because at least in more technical fields, which is what I'm mostly familiar with, the managers should be able to define what output means and be able to measure that. And then, as far as I'm concerned, it doesn't matter if you do it in 1 hour or 1 week, right? Assuming that 1 week is not an outrageously long time. But I think it should be more output focused and not, I saw you sit in front of a screen for 18 hours to do this.
Well, so everything's going to be revolutionized with more data, right? So you're familiar, we have the mutual connection who does dashboards for business analytics, and is making a good living, a very good living, in part because the older generations don't know how to use data. And so what they've been operating on are heuristics for generations in more traditional fields. So part of that was observing your employees. And now we're going to have better metrics that can be used for, improving workplace outcomes locally. And then that could allow for employees to work remotely and for management structure to change. And also the more controversial item right now that's quite interesting, huge area of discussion, is on reducing work hours to, in general, let's say, or going to the 4-day work week. So that's being discussed, as far as I understand, in Luxembourg presently. But it's not just Luxembourg. It's a huge push within my area of research in the well-being space, that we can reduce the number of work hours potentially, and potentially maintain the same level of output. And part of that might be acknowledging that people are working from home. And it used to be, when I was much younger, people were playing StarCraft at work. They were playing other various video games during working time. This was around the same time, just predating Facebook. So people were spending a lot of non-productive time at work. And we could potentially eliminate that. Also have more productive meetings and get to lower working hours and still have the same level of output.
So you mentioned life satisfaction and you mentioned happiness. So maybe this is a moment to dive into your research.
Sure.
Could you define what that even means and how we measure it? And I would love for you to go deeper into your research and give us some examples.
Yeah. So I'll just segue slightly with what I just mentioned with productivity and working hours. So there's research that happier people are more productive at work. So it's not just that we could eliminate, let's say, aspects of work that are not productive, but happier people are also more productive. And this is done in a couple of different ways. I'll mention kind of generally first, and then more specifically to my work. Mm-hmm. So happiness in that case is measured through kind of the emotional affective state. So we have 3 concepts of subjective well-being. Subjective, think it's up to the individual. Well-being, I think everybody understands that. And we have emotional states, referred to as affective, and they're more temporary. And we have cognitive well-being, which asks people to evaluate their lives. And there's a third, more philosophical one, which we can avoid for the moment. And so one way that they look at this or test this relationship is to look at sunlight and how it has a positive effect on people's emotional state. And they looked at call centers in the UK and found that those that were exposed to more sunlight had more productive calls. And so that was the call center. I looked at something that was a little bit more difficult, let's say, because the emotional state is temporary, right? And I wanted to look at the cognitive state, which is more lasting. So let me you can imagine lots of ways to measure the emotional state, including using various different biometrics like fMRIs or skin resistance. I forget that's not my actual area of focus, but I forget the term. I think skin resistance. So there are ways to measure that in an objective way. Mm-hmm. Typically, we use surveys because it's the most cost effective. In the evaluative way, it's going to be the answer to a question like the following. So all things considered, how satisfied are you with your life on a whole these days? Typically answered on a... Go ahead.
And that's to measure the cognitive or the emotional state?
That's to measure the cognitive.
Cognitive, right?
To evaluate. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, and so would you say that an analogy to understand the distinction between emotional and cognitive would be, say, if you're a parent to a small child and you sleep 3 hours per night, you're probably not exuberant, but you may still be satisfied with your life because being a parent is fulfilling. Would that be a good analogy?
That's my favorite example, actually. So typically speaking, they go hand in hand. They're highly correlated. So if you are emotionally experiencing if you experience positive emotions more than negative ones, you're also likely to report that your life is good when you evaluate your life. But there are instances when you didn't sleep well, and that could be because you're a single mother or parent, single parent, and then also feel not well, negative emotions, but then evaluate your life well. There's another one that's a bit interesting where people who are unemployed, this is going to get into my next bit of research too. People who are unemployed are dissatisfied with their life generally. It's a pretty negative and lasting effect, right? And we have tried to evaluate where that's coming from. Part of the idea is that you have a social network at work, especially if you are actually in your office. Even if you're not in your office, though, you still have a social network. It's partially an identity item, so people associate with their, the work that they do. There are a few aspects. At the same time, people often report low emotional well-being while they are at work. They're experiencing stress, frustration. Maybe they're tired. Sometimes they're angry. So it seems to be a little bit of a paradox. So there's also a small difference. But in general, go ahead.
Would it be fair to say that in order to have life satisfaction, there need to be some difficulties involved, as in frustration or something that is challenging, but that ultimately leads to satisfaction? That's kind of what I'm hearing from the things you just said.
Well, so I would say actually, no. You do not need to experience negative things, let's say, to evaluate your life well. So I believe that there's a nice perspective here, which is if you have gone through some challenges, that provides perspective. It gives you reason to appreciate what it is that you have. However, I must admit that a large proportion of your evaluative well-being is set by your genetics and upbringing. A large proportion. So it's not all. So most people in the United States are going to report on a scale from 0 to 10. I think it's going to be the majority are going to report at 6 or higher. And from a 0 to 10. So a lot of them are experiencing fairly high levels of well-being. And some of them, could be 18 years old and have not experienced many setbacks. As their life will change, of course. And there are theories related to what you're describing. Something instead of post-traumatic stress, we can also have post-traumatic growth. And we can also appreciate the investments we've made, such as going for a PhD and then finally being able to capitalize on that investment.
So when you ask people to evaluate their life satisfaction on a scale from 0 to 10, do you give them any kind of context to understand what a 5 or an 8 means for them?
No, sure.
Okay, and that would be anchoring, right? Or vignette surveys or something like that.
So there are lots of different things that can be done and ongoing research right now on the reliability and validity of these tests. And so what is state of the art right now is to ask people what it is that they were thinking about when they answered this question.
I see.
The idea is we don't want to frame it necessarily. In fact, it should come at the very beginning of the survey, because then we allow people to put into their utility function, if you want to think of this as utility, whatever it is that they want. So the strength of subjective well-being relative to everything else is I don't have the opportunity as the researcher to tell you what's important. You can choose to stay home and play video games, or you can choose to go to work, extra hours of the day, or you can invest in having a family and spending most of your time raising children or with your mother. So, and there's no paternalism in that regard. On occasion, we do want to know more of what it is that you were thinking about. But typically speaking, what we do is we just collect a host of other information at the same time, and we use regressions to disentangle the various components. And I mentioned, unemployment as being one of those factors as an example.
I want to circle back to that real quick. So have you ever explored in your research the idea of universal basic income and how that would affect happiness?
Indirectly, yes. Universal basic income, no. And I'm also trying to wrap my head around it. I think that there will be some more changes coming to our labor markets that may cause us to think differently, and also mean that past research may no longer be relevant. So the research that I have done, and actually I have several papers on this now, so I feel a little bit more confident in the work, is that people who reside in countries with a more generous welfare state, more generous social safety net, are happier. So the idea here is universal basic services or access to insurance of various forms, so unemployment insurance. Those people are happier. So I think a big part of this is health and health security, medical security, and family support policies. These things free up your mind to focus on other things that are, maybe more important to you. The one argument against universal basic income is that there is a certain amount of benefit people derive from working, from producing something of value. It's true that not everybody is doing something that they find valuable. So it's not necessarily the case that everyone is going to benefit from having a job, but certainly there are many. And I think right now the research is, we don't really know if this is another major challenge. So we don't really know if this is a good thing. And another major challenge is that frequently policies are not scaled. So the best state-of-the-art research that we're doing using, let's say, randomized control trials are frequently in a small setting with little external validity, and we don't know if it's going to scale to the societal level and how that might interact with other countries.
Right, and you could have network effects and spillover effects and things like that.
There's a host of factors. So we could have economies of scale, network effects. There's quite a few things there that make it difficult to tease out what's going to happen.
Yeah, and I guess that applies to the 4 days work week idea as well. And as an American living in Europe, I wanted to ask you, when I hear the idea that we could be as productive working 4 days instead of 5 days, what jumps to mind is the argument, well, but then I could work 5 days instead and make more money, right? And I think this is a very American way of thinking. And I have lived in the US for a long time now. So do you have a perspective on that distinction in terms of the mindset that Europeans have when it comes to work and Americans have? Because I often talk to people about this, and for me, it seems that it's just a difference in preferences. that there isn't a better or a worse one. It's more, what do you want? Do you want to have 6 weeks of continuous paid vacation every summer, or do you prefer to work and maybe retire earlier?
Right. So my very much American view is I don't like anything being imposed upon me. Imposed. The challenge, so taking a lot of vacation time, not being able to work extra time, these are things I don't like. However, I think that the cost I pay by it being imposed upon me is outweighed perhaps by the benefit. So this is a coordination challenge. So we need to coordinate as a society what's an acceptable amount of time to work per week, what's an acceptable amount of vacation, and when people should be in the office or available. And so then I think that we need to have either a cultural shift or government imposed action to coordinate. And so then I think that it can be relevant. Whether or not the European approach is better or worse than the American approach, I do think is partially a preference, largely a preference. We have seen with research, however, and well done research, that a reduction in working hours in France, also in Portugal, improved the happiness of the people there. There's also research, done by colleagues, kind of all extended colleagues, that we can reduce the number of working hours and still get the same productivity. And part of that is something that we would have talked about during the PhD program, about the number of hours in which you can work on the same task, or the number of hours you can work during a day and be productive. So I do think that there is a optimal amount of time, and it's going to vary from person to person. It's also going to vary on the type of task. So if you're doing intellectual work, probably, especially stuff that involves creativity, I think I improved the amount of time I could do this by drinking a very large amount of coffee. But then I crashed afterwards, and I had a headache. It was fun. So I think you get my point that it could be the case that we would be more productive by working 6 hours a day instead of 8 in the more creative spaces. And we need to coordinate around that activity to actually get that imposed, because otherwise, you'll be found uncompetitive, may not get your job promotion, etc.
Yeah. Although, I mean, at least me personally, right, I also have a problem with the idea of imposing things, because then who decides what the optimum is? And going back to the example of your friend who was able to reduce his working hours and still get the same output, right? I think I'm more a fan of the idea of deciding that this is the output that we need, and then giving people the flexibility to produce that output.
Right. And so I think that maybe we can get there with more data in the various different jobs, so that they say, all right, this is what I expect of you. And then, you can produce it however you want to. Right now, I don't think that's the world in which we live. And, it's mostly that you have to be in the office a certain number of hours and you have to be available. So we have a flexible work in my environment where, but I'm still required to be available certain hours of the day. So I can
and it makes sense.
Right. So it's a coordination issue. So I think that we can improve upon this and offer more flexibility going forward in certain spaces. There are some jobs where I think that, that'll be a challenge, right? The less intellectually active ones. And so, also the working time reduction that did occur in France didn't apply everywhere. It applied to certain firms of certain size. And, so probably there's no, silver bullets anywhere, but or one size fits all. Go ahead.
And I think there'll always be people who want to work more because they want to make more money. And that should also be available to them.
Yeah. And I think in a lot of cases it is, but frequently it's a side hustle kind of thing. Or if you own your own business, you can work as many hours as you want. I think that's true everywhere.
And I imagine there's a self-selection of people who choose to be entrepreneurs precisely because of that.
Yeah, that's a big area of focus in my research unit, are the people who want to be entrepreneurs. And actually, one of the first improvements in resolution that we have that I don't always think about as an outsider is you have entrepreneurs who are there because they see an opportunity, and you have entrepreneurs who are there because they feel like they've been forced to, meaning they had no alternative. And it's actually a fair number. Migrants are very frequently entrepreneurs, for example, international migrants, so foreign-born international migrants. And so it's a fairly complex field that I think we often get wrong from the outside.
Right, because I guess we think about Facebook or PayPal or something like that when we think about entrepreneurs, but there's people who have pizza restaurants, and those are entrepreneurs as well.
Absolutely. And there's a survival bias, in Facebook and the others. How many of their firms collapsed before they were able to do this? And think of, actually, we were doing our PhDs in LA. Think about all the actors and actresses, right? And you could think of them as being entrepreneurs. And ultimately, so many of them are working in service sector.
Definitely. So, okay, I want to ask you, can you say which countries are the happiest? Is that a statement that's possible to make?
I like the way you frame the question. So, yes, you can make the statement, but with a caveat. So I generally don't like to make comparisons across country because there are cultural differences. Nonetheless, we do it. So the World Happiness Report started in 2012, and it's called the World Happiness Report. And they produce one every year now. And it's the best source for this kind of information. And everybody goes for the rankings, but what you should do is actually read some of the work that's in there. So there's work on migrants, there's work on China, there's work on actually big data used in social sciences. So that's especially related to happiness. So the Nordic countries are the happiest countries, but culturally, they're the Nordic countries. They're also different than the Mediterranean countries. They're different than Latin America. They're different than East Asia. So I prefer to look at how they're changing over time instead, see if they're getting better or worse. And these countries have been doing fairly well. And some of the ones that have grown in happiness since the 1980s are surprising. It includes France, Spain, and Germany. These is based on a recent paper I published where we have the data going back to 1980, 81, 82. And part of the reason why they've had the biggest increase, though, is because they had a lower level to start with. So there are some challenges to, or you can think of this as convergence, not necessarily challenges, but I could get into challenges, although that's a whole long separate story.
I see you have some research on life satisfaction during COVID.
Yeah.
Could you give some perspectives on that?
Sure. So I would say that there's a few things to say. So life satisfaction did decline during COVID, but it also recovered fairly quickly. So people are adapting. This is one of the interesting things, and one of the challenges with studying subjective well-being is that you can think about your own brain, how you felt during this period of time. And the initial wave was quite a shock. And it was a combination of both lockdown measures and the risk of, you or a loved one getting ill. Mm-hmm. So there was a mix. But then during that summer, it was a little different in Europe. So most of my COVID research is in Europe. It was much more intermittent throughout the year. In the United States, just the geographic dispersion. In Europe, it mostly came down during the summer. And life satisfaction started to kind of come back up at this point. And if you look at the World Happiness Report, they measure these subjective well-being metrics, typically once a year. So they would compare 2019 with 2020. And if you just looked at the summer of 2019 to the summer of 2020, you might think that there was no impact of the pandemic. But in fact, at the peak of the wave, life satisfaction had come down basically as if the entire country had become unemployed overnight. So it was a big impact. It was a big shock. But then it started to recover. In general, our work suggests, and this was a interesting piece where we used some big data to help it provide the granularity in time. And we see that there was a downward trend throughout the year. In some other work where we have life satisfaction measured twice a year, we see basically at the peaks, each of the peaks, life satisfaction had declined, but then it starts to recover again as the wave decreases.
Are there any differences between countries and also reasons for those differences that one could pinpoint?
Yeah. So what I did is I looked primarily at the groups as a whole. So I didn't focus specifically on, one story in one country. That being said, what we do find is that lockdown was a challenge for people to deal with, but so was cases. So the number of deaths is what we focused on last. So countries that were able to contain the number of cases generally had a better reaction to the to the overall experience. And lockdown measures also, some of them felt a bit more arbitrary than others. So countries that I would say had higher trust in their government were generally feeling a bit better about the circumstance. And in fact, we show in a separate work that countries that experienced greater trust generally were more likely to comply with the policies that were implemented. So I can't get, there are famous stories about, Sweden having a challenge with, I think especially it was retirement homes, and they had no lockdown measures in the beginning. But I think some of the audience members are going to be able to describe these specific cases better than me. So I'll just say what we know generally, and then people can apply that to specific countries.
Right. So in this research about happiness, are there any areas of research that you're particularly excited about, either that you have done or that you're planning to work on? And kind of as a follow-up question to that is, why should people care? Why is this research important?
Yeah. Well, so there was an area that I was going to describe earlier, and I didn't fully describe. So I have an earlier paper where I show that the happier you are today, the more satisfied you are today. So it's this cognitive evaluation. The less likely you are to be unemployed a year from now. And part of that is because we have positive character skills, character traits that are associated with life satisfaction or this evaluative well-being. And so conscientiousness is one of the ones that people talk about a lot in labor economics. So the evaluative well-being is picking up factors that we think it should pick up, and is an indicator that can be used to predict, let's say, outcomes for individuals as well as at the society level. So this is an example where, so if we can improve the life satisfaction of these individuals, it's going to be associated with character skills. So in other ways, we could target the character skills of these individuals, these personality traits of individuals, which do change. They are not locked in place. Then we can improve their outcomes, their workplace outcomes.
So what you're saying is there's a causal effect between measures of life satisfaction and economic outcomes.
Oh,
and if we can, and then also assuming that we can, I guess, have a policy that affects these life satisfaction measures, then we can basically cause the economic outcomes to be better.
Right. So let's say what we have here is there's really a lot I can say. So you have the potential for a virtuous cycle. So you implement policies to improve the life satisfaction of individuals, then it can improve economic outcomes, which can then feed back into life satisfaction. So one example of this is the work week. So if you reduce working time, it improves life satisfaction, and which can feed back into productivity and economic workplace outcomes. and then people feel better about earning a higher income, for example. So we talked about it a little bit differently before because this has the offset of reducing working time. But if you implement alternative policies, well, I'll give you an example. And again, there's a lot to say here. But early research, I think it's 2013, looks at the 100 best companies to work for in the United States. And this is conducted by independent organization. And they found that those companies earn 2.1% above their industry benchmarks. So you can improve workplace conditions, oftentimes with low cost. Part of that is just finding out how your employees are doing and what needs to be changed. Some of that can be done at very low cost, and then this improves the outcomes. I just want to say something related about attitude and how these subjective responses can influence later life outcomes. So I have work that looks at the let's say the future views, your views of your future, and it's just a subjective response, and it's more predictive of how long you're going to live than your income is. So you could think of this as just having a positive attitude towards your future is more predictive of how long you're going to live. And so these measures matter in part for that. So if we can improve optimism, this idea of what I was just mentioning, then you can have positive impacts on health and labor outcomes.
Right. So it sounds to me like, for example, tech companies, right, often have these initiatives of, we'll give you a free lunch and to improve employee satisfaction. And some of these things, I guess, are appreciated. A lot of these things seem misguided, and I don't know who comes up with them. So it sounds to me like incorporating the type of actual rigorous research you do more frequently into, for example, company policies would be beneficial. And is that something, do you see this integration of the kind of academic work you do into the public or private sector?
So this area of research is exploding from a small base, but it's exploding. So I have close colleagues, friends who are doing this work, and there's an example where it is complicated and the rigor matters. So they go to the workplace and they ask the employees what it is that they want, what they need. And then they also ask managers. And communicating to the two of them, you might want to talk about the sorry, I'm looking at the wrong word. The condition that causes both workplace well-being and engagement, let's say. So you tell the manager you're going to focus on engagement, and you tell the employee that you're going to focus on well-being. And so, and then you can get the condition for both of those and try to implement them. But you want to use different language in talking to the different groups, because part of it is there's this term I think a lot of people are focusing on these days. Signal virtuing. Sorry, virtue signaling. And a lot of employees think that, or they're giving me a free lunch and they want me to work extra hours. And then it actually causes the opposite to happen. They feel less engaged because they don't feel like it's genuine. So it is important to use the right words in communicating this and doing appropriate research to figure out what people actually need.
So this might sound a lot like psychology to some people. Maybe you could discuss why your research is not psychology, or how it's different from psychology, or maybe some other fields that are very related to what you do.
Yeah, it's true that, let's say, the main variable is it's a psychological one. It's psychometrically validated. So that's how we have some confidence that we're measuring what we think we're measuring. So the techniques that we're using are a bit different than the typical psychologist, and primarily that's by looking at larger samples of people. So frequently we're using observational data coming from national surveys. We have nationally representative insight on what's going on. So we have, let's say, 1,000 people or so. And so then our goal is to come up with policy, especially for me, I'm working in this statistical office where we have applied the goal is to come up with like applied economic research and where there's a policy implication. And to do something in that regard, you need to have some confidence in the estimate you're coming up with, in the relationship that you're coming up with. And that's internal validity, but you also want it to apply to a broader group of people, so have some external validity as well. So that's, I would say, the starting point. And then from economic theory, you can think of, including Gary Becker and some others, but Nobel Prize winner Becker said that maximizing happiness, maximizing subjective well-being, is the same to people as essentially maximizing their utility. So there's the whole behavioral economics literature and understanding how and why people do what they do and how to, let's say, improve those outcomes. So you can think of this as overlapping there. Or you could think of it as at the national policy agenda, and instead of trying to, let's say, improve economic growth as a target for policy, we can improve people's well-being instead. So it's actually, let's say, a more precise measure of what economists, let's say, broadly speaking, would like to do. And then we're going to try to use some of the same tools that economists use, which would really set us apart from the psychologist.
Right. So do you have any tips for econ PhD students or economists early in their career about how to be a successful researcher, and maybe speak to some of the trade-offs that you've seen between doing research versus working in the private sector?
Yeah. Well, I would say that there's been a couple of pieces of advice that are really relevant no matter what you're doing. So I mentioned before about opening doors. So network. And I would say do this in a genuine way. So when you have a reason to reach out to someone, you have a reason to compliment their work, or a reason to ask a question in a seminar, don't hold back. Do it. I have benefited strongly from my network, and part of that has been quite literally asking a question in a seminar that the speaker liked. That led to one of my first better publications, and a postdoc that led to some strong benefits. And I have continued to benefit afterwards. People, I think, a lot of times, so that would be the way to focus, I think, initially. And don't be afraid to ask for things. It was recommended to, when you're practicing your job market talk, to present it as many times as possible, and to reach out to your network and ask people if you can present. And what this does is it gives you an opportunity, quite literally, to present, but also puts you in front of more people who might themselves be open or available to, to jobs, to offering you a position. Then,
and I think,
go ahead.
Oh, sorry, go ahead. No, it's just part of this is the idea that you never know what opportunities there are unless you talk to people.
Yep, there's research on Facebook network connections. And typically speaking, the network connection that got a person a job wasn't their, the first level, because you're spending a lot of time talking to your friends, your immediate colleagues, and a lot of times you have a shared information set. You need to get one level out to get a more, to get a different information. So, do not be afraid to ask for, an opportunity to present, or do not be afraid to speak up. I do recommend thinking ahead of time. Think about how you're going to be received. Everyone is busy. Try never to waste anyone's time. If you can answer a question yourself, don't ask somebody else that. Think about your question in advance. So I take a lot of notes when I'm in a seminar, and I write things down, and I think about it so that I ask a better question. And then I always ask questions, pretty much. That's some very specific advice. And a little bit of a different direction. Unfortunately, as a PhD in economics, you have many offered opportunities, but not necessarily the opportunity to do what you want. you can't just go in and do good research and get a job. You're competing with people all around the world, quite literally. You need to think ahead and try to balance between what you're interested in and what other people are interested in.
So this basically means at some point you may have to compromise between these are the actual jobs that are available, and then there's going to be trade-offs. Some of them allow me to pursue my quote unquote true interest, but there may be other drawbacks, right? It may be a location that's not that appealing to you.
It's really a challenge. What generally anyone should do is they should find out the placement of people in a role that they're considering. So then you can get a sense of what the actual outcomes are of a position and find out if that's what you want. So actually bringing it back to the happiness research, there's an interesting book that talks about how we do a bad job of predicting our happiness. So a lot of people will think about their sports team winning and how happy that's going to make them. But then it's very short-lived. Oftentimes it's a Sunday night and you have to get home after that and go to work in the morning. So we are focused on sometimes the wrong things. And this is much more important than just the sports team that you may be interested in. It also relates to moving to Los Angeles or to Seattle or to Europe, which type of job to take. So frequently we focus on a limited set of information, the most salient things that we're excited about, things that we're dreading. And we forget the traffic, the cost of living, the types of colleagues that we're going to work with. We change inevitably as humans. There's this end of history bias. We think that we're fixed at our current state, but in fact, we change quite a lot and we move more towards the people that we interact with. That includes our colleagues. So the recommendation to get this better is to ask people in the roles in which you're thinking about. So the roles, meaning very specifically like a job, but also location. What are the drawbacks? What are the benefits? What do these individuals wish they had considered before making a shift? And then you have just a better set of information to think about before making a decision.
And it sounds like it's also about bringing the focus from those salient things like the salary or the name of the city to the more mundane aspects of life. How far do you typically drive to get groceries, right? Simple things like that. Is there good availability of schools for your kids?
Absolutely.
How often does it rain?
Absolutely. And also, part of this is what we adapt to and what we don't adapt to. So I mentioned COVID as something that we adapt to, but there are things that we don't. So unemployment is something, poverty is something that we don't adapt to. Poor health is something, while chronic health conditions, something you don't adapt to. Income is something you do. Part of that is that your standard of living changes. So what you expect from your standard of living, what kind of car you want to drive, probably in college, a lot of us had been eating just at the canteen, the cafeteria, or just horrible, microwave noodles. And then you expect much nicer things. And you compare yourself also with a different set of people. Part of I tried to be brief. Part of the benefit of various different goods in our lives are the relative rank, the status associated with those objects. But then we compare ourselves with different people.
Yeah, and I think that's something you see, right? Like having lived in LA, the car is a status thing, and you see people having cars which they don't need really, and paying more than they could probably afford for a car that just because it's a thing.
Well, in the cars, at least there's some functional value frequently, at least.
Well, there is, right? But you can go from point A to B
with something
in
less
a
expensive.
Hyundai, and you can go from point A to B in a Mercedes. And one thing is if you can afford it, but then sometimes maybe people have trouble paying other necessities because they chose a car that's more expensive than they could afford because of this
or they're
keeping up
going
with the
to
Joneses.
retire much later. As one of the things you mentioned, somebody wants to retire early. Best way to do that is to spend less today. Take that savings and get the compound interest, and you're going to also adjust your expectations from retirement. You need less money to retire earlier if you don't need a Mercedes or designer clothing. That was the thing in LA. I think, designer handbags, and, there's a quality difference occasionally, but a lot of times it's just the name brand. And from that, I see no value. And I guess fast fashion is worse, but only barely.
Yeah, and it's not really, right? It's not a judgment. It's more about trade-offs, which is so inherent in what we think about in economics. So for most people, buying a more expensive car implies a trade-off somewhere else. And then some people have so many resources, they don't have the same kind of trade-offs. And I think that's wonderful for those people. But in general, having the mindset of what are the trade-offs I'm making?
And even those wealthy people, particularly fortunate, could be spending that money in charitable ways. And we do see that, among some people. But this is a way to lastingly improve your happiness. And also, I think, is arguably good from an ethical point of view as well. It's nice when they can choose it for themselves, right? Compared to, say, a coerced position in a high tax state. But it's one thing that they could do with that money instead of, a designer car or handbag.
Yeah. And I feel like we have material for a whole nother podcast about happiness. I would actually be really interested to look at happiness through the lens of how much money do you have and what do you do with that money. So maybe that's a topic for another conversation. But in the meantime, do you have any closing thoughts? Is there something that you would like to share that we haven't talked about?
There is, one thing there's a lot to talk about. So thank you for giving me this opportunity. A growing number of the OECD countries, so the club of rich countries around the world, are monitoring the well-being of their residents, in a more complex, cohesive, coherent way that frequently involved consultations with the stakeholders. So the public, but also various institutions, organizations, nonprofits, unions, to get a sense of what's going on. So we need to do the same thing in countries and also in organizations, firms, to improve the well-being of so in every organization, I think we could do this. They're doing this in a particular way now, which is more advanced than it's ever been. And my recollection off the top of my head is it's more than 20 out of the 37 countries, OECD countries. And also nearly 10 of them are using this information for policymaking in both the policy design as well as evaluation. So this is there's a growing amount of support for these tools. And I'm optimistic that it's going to have an impact so that we can reverse some of the trends that people are experiencing. I frequently have almost an argument with people from the US or people from Europe, because I'm sitting a little bit in between, about the things that have happened in the past 50 years. So in general, life has gotten a lot better. But in the last 15, 20 years or so, it doesn't feel that way. Depression rates are on the rise. And it's not just diagnostics. Depression is really on the rise.
Right. So something that comes to mind is social media and
absolutely
the use of, right, especially among young people. So we still remember a world when you did not have a smartphone. And what it feels like to not have this urge to constantly pick up and click and scroll. I can even imagine what it must be growing up and not knowing that. It seems horrifying to me, right? Because at least for me personally, I am aware that if I use internet in an inappropriate way, I feel bad. But I'm able to see that because I have a benchmark.
Right. And so it may be the case that we just need to provide more of an opportunity and guidance on introspection, so people can, learn from their own experiences, what makes them feel better, and then give them the opportunity to do some experimentation and I would like, so that my normative statement is to change the orientation of the world away from status towards, let's say, introspection, such that people can make themselves feel better and learn how to do this. And I believe that we're moving in that direction, although slowly. And we may have to break a few eggs in the process, but I think that we're moving in the right direction, or there is a sub-trend moving in the right direction.
Okay. Kelsey, this is really, really fascinating. I will extract names of some of the books you mentioned from you after to put links, and I would love to have a follow-up conversation at some point. I want to go and read some of the research now. So
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for making the time.
Yep, thank you. I appreciate being here and having the opportunity to share what I love. So, thank you.